we don't want to operate a boiler into that seat tightness range because doing so would damage those valves and cost us efficiency. So first of all, it kind of helps to start at the design pressure, also called the max allowable working pressure of the boiler, and subtract from there. So even though I may have, a stereotypical fire tube boiler that has a maximum allowable working pressure of 150 psi, I can't actually operate that boiler at 150 psi, even though it's called the maximum allowable working pressure. And one of the biggest reasons for that is the safety valve deadband. So if I have a maximum allowable working pressure of 150 psi, then I could set the safety valves at 150 psi. And I could even set one or more of the safety valves above 150 psi. Just the lowest one has to be right at that 150. There's a bunch of rules for how big the safety valves need to be in relation to each other and how far apart they can be set. We don't need to go into all that today. For the purposes of trying to determine the highest pressure I can operate my boiler at, though, I need to know that if I have a safety valve and my lowest safety valve is set at 150, your typical safety valve has a seat tightness rating of about 10%. So that means 10% below 150, that safety valve is going to start to weep or simmer or leak by, even though it hasn't fully lifted yet. The valve will fully lift plus or minus 3% from its nameplate setting. But before it lifts, it's going to simmer and weep, and that leakage can cause the seats of the valve to be damaged, and also it can cause us to waste energy up that vent stack. So we don't want to operate a boiler into that seat tightness range because doing so would damage those valves and cost us efficiency. We'd like to have it trip before we get there. Does the code require that? No, not necessarily. So best practice would be to say, okay, 150 psi valve, 15 psi below, that's 135 psig. Well, that's the point where my valve may start to leak. So I want to trip there, right? Well, maybe. Because if I'm using a pressure switch to trip the boiler on high steam pressure, that pressure switch might not activate until, a few psi either way. It's really hard to set it precisely at, within 1/10 of a psi or something, precisely at 134.8. So I may actually want to set that high pressure switch at 130 so that it trips before I lift safety valves. Well, if I'm tripping a pressure switch at 130, well, that may be a couple psi either way, so I probably don't want to run the boiler above 125. Okay, so if the boiler's not to run above 125, where's my normal steam pressure going to be? Probably something like 120. So if I'm running at 120 and then the load in the plant comes offline quickly, that pressure may coast up a little bit while the boiler backs down. I want to make sure that I give myself some operating range for that boiler so that the boiler can ramp down and the pressure coasts up a little bit and I don't hit those trips that would require a manual operator reset. So this is an ideal scenario. Have I seen people run their 150 psi design boilers above 120? Absolutely. But you're tightening up all those dead bands. You're starting to overlap things to where I could have a safety valve that under certain situations, the safety valve simmers and my boiler's not tripping, or a safety valve lifts and my boiler's not tripping. And those things can happen, but it's just not ideal. Ideally, I can take the dead band of all those switches and all those devices and make sure that they kind of work in order and that I don't have a boiler tripping after a safety valve is lifted or something of that nature. So there is some flexibility for how these things are set up. You'll want to work with your boiler service provider to figure it out. But it is important to know you're really never going to run a 150 psi design boiler above 135 unless you're getting some specialty equipment. So just something to talk about there. I guess I assumed we have a 10% seat tightness safety valve because that's kind of the industry standard. You can buy a tighter valve. You could buy a valve that had a 3% or a 5% seat tightness. It's going to cost you more money, but they do exist. The other thing is some jurisdictions, not all, but some jurisdictions will allow pilot-operated safety valves on Section 1 boilers. But you're going to have to work with your state boiler chief to make sure that you can do that. But those would have a tighter seat tightness value that you could run closer to that design pressure. Again, this doesn't usually end up being an issue because we know the steam pressure we need to operate when we're designing the system and procuring the boilers, and so we can build in the appropriate amount of headroom. If somebody needs 150 or 160 pound steam, they're going to go with a 200 psig design boiler. Anyway, I hope that helps kind of demystify what our maximum operating pressure is and kind of how we can get there versus what's the maximum allowable working pressure and what that means. Again, maximum allowable working pressure is your code calculated design pressure, so to speak, not actually what you're going to run at. What you're actually going to run at is going to be below that according to the dead bands of valves and switches and things and kind of how you stack that up.